As much as I love the Porsche 911, I understand that with so many different versions and generations, the vernacular that surrounds this car can be confusing. Just to quickly rattle off a couple models, there's the Carrera S, the Carrera T, the ST, the GTS, the GT3, and the GT2. And for those that are not hardcore Porsche fans, I think this can be a little bit intimidating. I truly do not believe that there are any other performance cars that are on sale today that do such a good job covering all the bases and covering such a wide range in terms of price and performance. So with the 911 available in so many different variations, the goal of this video is not to provide an in-depth analysis on all the differences between them. Instead, we are going to cover at a high level as many different variations of the 911 as we possibly can, with the goal of trying to build a better foundation to understand this car. So to start us off, I just want to briefly talk about what makes the 911 so unique. For one, the 911 is one of the longest continually produced sports cars. Now, if you watch some of my other videos, you know that I've said similar things about the Corvette and the Mustang, but this is a lot more impressive for the 911 when you take a few different things into account. For one, for most of Porsche's history, it was a tiny automaker compared to the likes of Ford or GM, meaning that they were a lot more resource confined, and they weren't just producing a sports car as a marketing ploy to sell kind of more pedestrian models. No, the 911 was Porsche's core product, so it had to be successful. Additionally, the 911 uses an engine design and layout that is basically unlike any other new car on sale today, with that engine design being a flat six and the layout being rear engine. While other automakers over the years have dabbled in flat engines and rear engine layouts, it is truly synonymous with the 911. And understanding those two things is critical to just understanding the nature of the 911. Because over the years, many people have said that this car needs to change, yet Porsche has stayed true to the original tenets of this car. A 2025 Porsche 911 uses a flat six engine and a rear engine layout the same way that the original car did back in the 1960s. Now, before we dive into the specific versions of the 911, we are going to touch on the generations. The 911 that is on sale today, you will hear referred to as the 992. 992 is the car's chassis code, and every time that the 911 gets a major redesign, it gets a new chassis code and it is referred to as a new generation. The 992 came out in 2018, which actually means that it's approaching its mid-cycle refresh. Generally, during every generation of 911, about halfway through its life cycle, there is a minor redesign, and that car is deemed the Dot 2. So currently, right now, kind of midway through 2024, we are just starting to learn about some of the design changes that Porsche is making for the 992.2 generation of the 911. Now, because of that, some of the models that we are talking through today might be changed, there might be new models added, or they could be dropped altogether. So I'm going to try to speak as generally as possible. And we will start with the models that are the most solidified in the 911 lineup and leave some of the kind of special editions for last. So without further ado, the first 911 model that we are going to talk about is the Carrera. And for the past few generations, the Carrera has been the entry level, the base model 911. Now, I do think referring to it as a base model is doing this car a little bit of a disservice. It is still an extremely nice, high-performing, and well-appointed vehicle, and honestly, it should be, because the base model 911 has gotten expensive with a starting price of around $115,000. Nowadays, the Carrera is only available with an automatic PDK transmission, and it makes 380 horsepower out of a turbocharged flat six engine. While the Carrera might not be super impressive just based on the raw numbers, you have to remember that this is the car that all of the higher end versions of the 911 is based upon. When Porsche goes to design the $350,000 GT2, they are not redesigning every single part of the car. So as a result, the base model Carrera has to be even more upmarket than what its price might suggest. Now, with that being said though, the Carrera is still the entry-level model, so it's not going to get any crazy bells and whistles. So like no rear steering and no crazy aerodynamics. Ultimately, just to zoom out, the Carrera is intended to be the entry point into the 911 lineup. Now, the next car we are going to touch on is the Carrera S. Largely, this model is extremely similar to the base model Carrera, but it just gets a little bit more performance. In the past, the Carrera and Carrera S would actually have different sized motors, which would make up that power difference. But nowadays, they basically use the same exact engine, just with the boost turned up a little bit higher in the Carrera S. For the 992.1 generation, the Carrera S is up about 65 horsepower and about $15,000 over the base model Carrera. Now, before we go any further, there's a few important things to keep in mind that help differentiate some of these more mass market versions of the 911. And that would be the availability of all-wheel drive, as well as two different types of removable roofs. For all-wheel drive versions of the 911, there is a 4 inserted into the name. For example, a Carrera 4 or a Carrera 4S. For the removable roof, the first variation is a Targa, which is a removable hardtop. And then there is the Cabriolet, which is a more traditional soft top convertible. And just to make things a little bit more confusing, for the 992, the Targa drops the Carrera nameplate and is only available in all-wheel drive. So all of these cars are going to be Targa 4 or Targa 4S's. But for the Cabriolet, everything can still kind of be mixed and matched. So you could have a Carrera Cabriolet 4, a Carrera Cabriolet S, or a Carrera Cabriolet 4S. Now, earlier I referred to the Carrera and Carrera S as being the mass market versions of the 911. And honestly, this has more to do just with market positioning than actual sales numbers, because Porsche does sell a lot of volume with some of their higher end cars. But for simplicity's sake, you can just think of all of these as being the normal models of the 911. And there's one more version that I'm going to group with these, and that would be the GTS. The GTS is intended to be the highest performance version of this kind of group of mass market 911s. If we think of the Carrera S as being a hopped up version of the base model Carrera, where performance is increased by maybe 15 to 20%, then the GTS is similar in the fact that it is a hopped up version of the Carrera S. It's getting more power, better brakes, and more standard performance equipment. So while the Carrera S, and the GTS are what I would consider to be the mass market, quote unquote, normal versions of the 911, there's one more additional car that is extremely similar to these vehicles, but is kind of in its own lane, and that would be the Carrera T. Something that Porsche loves doing is making their cars seem unique, race-focused, but also selective and customizable. And this is something that Porsche has done an excellent job of doing with their higher-end GT cars. But the Carrera T is intended to offer this experience, but at the lower end of the 911 lineup, by being a lightweight version of the base Carrera. The Carrera T uses the base model 911 powertrain, but adds performance through things like PASM Sport suspension, the Sport Chrono package, and also saves weight through things like the removal of sound deadening and lightweight glass. Overall, the role of the Carrera T is meant to be a special version of the 911, but at a lower price point than some of the GT cars. And before we dive into those GT cars, there's two more models that I want to talk about, and that would be the Turbo and the Turbo S. Now, the point of today's video is not to give you a history lesson, but just know that for a long period of the 911's history, the Turbo was actually its highest performance model. In the present day, the Turbo is really like the supercar fighter version of the 911. And similar to how we differentiated between the Carrera and the Carrera S, the same holds true for the Turbo and the Turbo S. Both of these cars are very similar, but the Turbo S is just another layer of performance on top of the normal Turbo. The Turbo S specifically makes 640 horsepower. It's also all-wheel drive, and we know that Porsche has a very advanced launch control system, so this car is capable of some very fast 0 to 60 times. And the Turbo S is a massive leap in performance over the top of the line of the more mass market versions in the GTS. Over the GTS, the Turbo S makes approximately 160 more horsepower, but you're also paying for it too with a starting price that is $80,000 higher. Now, one of the biggest reasons why somebody decides to buy a Turbo S over something like a Lamborghini or a McLaren is because the Turbo S is a little bit of a sleeper. It doesn't feature any kind of crazy wing or other aero, and unless you're kind of already into Porsches, most people aren't going to be able to differentiate it from a normal Carrera. Now we are finally going to talk about the GT cars, and we'll start with the GT3. Now, in the automotive community, there is a cliche that we often hear, and that is that a certain car is a street legal race car. And while this is often hyperbole, the GT3 and the GT3 RS are actually probably the closest things to a street legal race car that you're going to be able to find for under like $300,000. These cars are very similar and share a lot of parts with Porsche's GT3 Cup race car. Some also argue that the GT3 is the purest version of the 911 available, mainly because it features a super high revving, naturally aspirated engine, and it is also still available with a manual transmission. Now, for the GT3 RS, it is an even more hardcore track-focused version of the GT3. And especially with the latest generation of the 911, the 992, the gap between the GT3 and the GT3 RS has continued to widen. And the GT3 RS is truly a car that requires a racetrack to fully exploit its performance. It's got some very crazy, aggressive aerodynamics, and I mean, this car features DRS, which is just absolutely insane. Now, quick sidebar, if you're wondering about the GT4, that is not actually a version of the 911. The GT4 is giving the GT treatment to another car in Porsche's lineup in the Cayman, but for the sake of this video, just know that that is not a version of the 911. Next up, for the highest performance version of the 911, there is the GT2 RS. The GT2 is a very special car, and Porsche generally only builds a limited production run in the very late years for each generation. So late in the years of the 992.2, will we expect to see a GT2. Now, you can think of the GT2 as just being a 911 that is full tilt towards performance. It takes all of the best performance parts from all the other versions of the 911 and puts them into one car. If you want to think about it really simply, you take a hopped up version of the Turbo S's engine and put it in a highly modified GT3 RS body. And generally, whenever a new GT2 comes out, it basically breaks every single production car lap record at racetracks around the world. So to zoom back out a little bit, all of the different versions of the 911 that we have talked about so far, they are what I would consider to kind of be the bread and butter of the 911 lineup. They have all been in the lineup for a few generations now, and I would say with near certainty that they will continue production into the future. So now we are going to take a deeper dive into some of the more obscure 911 models, some of the special editions that they have been producing as of late. And the car that we will start this discussion with is the ST. Now, if you do know 911s, you know for the 991 generation, they built a car called the 911R. For the 992, the 911R has converted over to being the ST. And this is a car that is meant to be the absolute purest version of the 911. Now, for people that are obsessed with the Porsche 911, I think there's kind of like two different sides to their brain. One side says you want a car to chase lap times, a car that is just an absolute track day weapon. While the other side wants a car that provides the maximum amount of driving engagement. And the ST is certainly a car that is designed for the engagement side. Basically, the ST uses the GT3 RS's engine, but mates it up to a manual transmission that's not available in the GT3 RS, and also puts it into a sleek body that doesn't feature any super aggressive aero. And currently the ST is probably the most sought after version of the 992.1 generation, mainly because they built it in such low numbers. The next model that we are going to touch on is the 911 Dakar. The Dakar is basically a production rally car, which is a little bit of a wild concept. Porsche does have a history in rally racing, and with Lamborghini coming out with their off-road version of the Huracan, it and the Dakar are basically creating a new segment of rally-inspired supercars. Now, to talk about what the Dakar actually is, it's basically a 911 Carrera GTS 4 that Porsche adds some additional ground clearance to, as well as skid plates, to make it more capable off-road. Another special edition Porsche model is the Sport Classic. The Sport Classic is meant to harken back to the glory days of the 911 turbo cars. And basically, you can think about it as being a 911 turbo that features a manual transmission and rear-wheel drive. And the very last 911 model that we will touch on is the Speedster. Now, Porsche has not released a Speedster version of the 992 yet, but basically, you can think of this car as being a convertible version of the GT3. So we just covered a lot of ground there, and if it's not abundantly clear, Porsche does kind of slice the 911 very thin. There are so many different versions of this car, but I do think that is great because there really is a 911 for every possible use case. And because I know that this might still be confusing, we are going to do a speed round just to recap everything that we've talked about so far. So the current generation of 911 that is on sale today is the 992. The 992 is about to get a minor refresh, and then all the cars that are on sale will be 992.2 911s. The base model, entry-level version of the 911 is the Carrera. If you add a little bit of performance to that car, you get a Carrera S. And then if you add even more performance to the Carrera S, you end up with the GTS. And with those three cars, the Carrera S, and the GTS, this encompasses what I would think of as the normal 911 models. And for these normal models, having the number 4 in its name means that it is all-wheel drive. Having the word Targa means that it is a removable hardtop. And having the word Cabriolet means that it is a soft-top convertible. Then you have the 911 Turbo, which is kind of like the supercar sleeper version of the 911. If you add more performance to the Turbo, you end up with a Turbo S. Then you have the GT3, which is like the race car version of the 911. If you then add more race car to the GT3, you end up with a GT3 RS. And then Porsche's full tilt track weapon is the GT2 RS. And all of these models that I just talked about up until this point, I would say are kind of like the core bread and butter versions of the 911. For some of the special edition cars, there is the Carrera T, which is a lightweight version of the base model Carrera. There is the ST, which is a GT3 RS with a manual transmission and no aero. There's the Sport Classic, which is a rear-wheel drive manual transmission version of the Turbo. There's also the Dakar, which is a rally-focused version of the GTS. And lastly, there is the Speedster, which you can think of as being a convertible version of the GT3. Now, keep in mind that Porsche is constantly changing the 911 lineup. They're changing things on individual cars. They're adding new models, dropping other models. It really is just continually evolving. But if there's anything that's still unclear, be sure to let me know in the comments, and I hope this was helpful.